I don't know why I stopped at that particular gas station. I usually try to make it through the long stretch of highway without pulling over unless it's absolutely necessary. But that night, something felt off. Maybe it was the exhaustion setting in after hours of driving, or the eerie emptiness of the road. Whatever it was, I found myself pulling into a shabby-looking station in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't even a modern station, more like one of those ancient ones with the analog pumps and peeling paint on the walls. A dim, flickering neon sign above the building spelled "Open" in a half-hearted attempt at welcoming customers. The parking lot was empty, except for an old, rusted-out sedan that looked like it hadn't been driven in decades. I stepped out of my car, the chill of the desert night biting through my jacket. The silence was heavy, pressing in on me like a weight. The only sound was the faint buzz of the neon sign and the crunch of gravel under my boots. As I approached the pump, I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the parking lot, just barely visible in the shadows. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. Creepy, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I inserted my card into the pump and started filling my tank, all the while keeping one eye on the shadowy figure. He took a step closer, and then another. By the time the tank was full, he was standing in the dim light of the station, about 20 feet away. I could see him more clearly now, a tall man wearing a dusty coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. His posture was rigid, unnatural, as if he were a mannequin come to life. "Need something?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. I hurried back to my car and slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I glanced up, expecting the man to still be standing there. He was gone, just gone. There was no way he could have moved out of sight that quickly, not unless he'd sprinted into the darkness, and I would have heard that. Heart pounding, I threw the car into gear and sped out of the parking lot, tires kicking up gravel as I merged back onto the highway. I thought that was the end of it, just a weird encounter with some drifter or local oddball. But about 20 miles down the road, my headlights illuminated something that made my stomach drop. It was him, standing by the side of the highway, exactly as he had been at the gas station. I slammed on the brakes, my car screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his coat billowing slightly in the night breeze. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe it wasn't the same guy. Maybe I was just imagining things because I was so tired. But deep down, I knew it was him. Without thinking, I locked my doors again and floored the accelerator, swerving around him as I sped past. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see. All I cared about was getting as far away from that man as possible. For the next hour, I drove in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road was empty, the desert stretching out on either side like an endless void. I kept telling myself it was over, that I'd imagined the whole thing, but the tension in my chest wouldn't ease. Then I saw the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I was relieved. Another car on this godforsaken road meant I wasn't alone anymore. But as the vehicle got closer, I realized something was wrong. The lights were moving too fast, gaining on me at an alarming rate. Panic set in as the car, if it even was a car, pulled up beside me. I risked a glance out my window and nearly screamed. It wasn't a car. It was the same rusted-out sedan I'd seen at the gas station, now barreling down the highway at an impossible speed. And behind the wheel was the man in the coat, his wide-brimmed hat still obscuring his face. I hit the gas, pushing my car to its limit. The sedan matched my speed effortlessly, the engine growling like a wild animal. It swerved closer, forcing me toward the edge of the road. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt them on me, burning with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the sedan veered off the road and disappeared into the darkness. There was no sound of a crash, no dust cloud, nothing. It was as if it had never been there. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, my hands trembling as I pulled into the parking lot of a well-lit diner. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. I never saw the man, or the sedan, again. But sometimes, late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure in my rearview mirror, standing by the side of the road, and I'll wonder if he's still out there, waiting for me. I was halfway through a road trip to visit a friend in another state when I decided to stop for some food. It was late, somewhere around 2 a.m., and I hadn't seen another car on the road for what felt like hours. When I finally spotted a flickering sign for a 24-hour diner at the edge of a small rest area, I felt a wave of relief. Food and coffee were exactly what I needed to shake off the exhaustion. The parking lot was empty except for a single truck parked near the entrance. The diner itself looked like it had seen better days. Faded red paint peeled from the exterior, and the windows were coated in a thin layer of grime. But I wasn't about to be picky. I walked inside, and a bell above the door jingled softly. The place was silent. No chatter from other customers, no clinking dishes in the kitchen, just the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The air smelled faintly of grease and something metallic, like rust. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 50s, wearing a white apron smeared with something dark. He had deep-set eyes that followed me as I walked to a booth. His face was expressionless, but his gaze was heavy, unsettling. I sat down and grabbed the laminated menu from the table. It was sticky to the touch, and the selections were oddly generic: breakfast, burger, pie. No descriptions or prices. I looked around, half expecting someone else to walk in, but the diner remained eerily quiet. The man eventually shuffled over to my booth, holding a notepad that looked like it hadn't been used in years. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice flat. Just coffee and a burger," I replied, trying to sound casual. He nodded and walked back to the kitchen without another word. As I waited, I glanced around the diner. There were a few old photos on the walls, black and white snapshots of people smiling in front of the diner, their faces frozen in time. One photo caught my eye. It showed a group of people sitting in the exact booth I was in. They were laughing, holding mugs of coffee, but something about their faces didn't seem right. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too blank. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I turned my attention back to the table and noticed something scratched into the surface of the wood. At first, I thought it was just graffiti, but as I traced the words with my finger, a chill ran down my spine. "Don't eat, don't drink, leave now." I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. It looked like it had been carved with something sharp, the edges of the letters rough and uneven. Before I could think too much about it, the man returned with my order. He placed a steaming mug of coffee and a plate with a burger in front of me, then shuffled back to the counter without a word. I stared at the food, my appetite suddenly gone. The coffee smelled bitter, almost chemical, and the burger looked wrong. The bun was lopsided, the patty gray and rubbery. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to take a sip of the coffee anyway, hoping the caffeine would help me focus. The taste was vile, like burnt metal. I gagged and set the mug down, wiping my mouth on my sleeve. That's when I noticed the man watching me from behind the counter. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth was stretched into a thin, unnatural smile. The man's smile sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't friendly, it was predatory, like he was waiting for something. I pushed the coffee mug away and tried to steady my breathing. I think I'll just pay for the coffee and go," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. He just kept staring at me, that unsettling grin plastered on his face. I reached for my wallet and pulled out a 20, setting it on the table. As I stood to leave, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like I was being watched by more than just the man behind the counter. I glanced over my shoulder and froze. The people in the photos on the wall, They were looking at me. Their heads had turned ever so slightly, their blank eyes now fixed on me. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over my chair. The man behind the counter let out a low, guttural chuckle. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice distorted, as if two people were speaking at once. Suddenly, the lights in the diner flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the space. The beam of light swept across the room, landing on the photos. The people in them were no longer still. They were moving, their faces twisted and contorted, their mouths opening in silent screams. Panicking, I turned toward the door, but it was no longer there. The entrance had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. I spun around, shining my light at the man behind the counter, only to find that he was gone too. In his place stood a figure that barely resembled a man, tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs and glowing red eyes. "You shouldn't have stopped here," it hissed, its voice echoing unnaturally. I bolted toward the back of the diner, hoping to find an exit. The kitchen door was ajar, and I pushed through it, my flashlight illuminating rows of rusted equipment and piles of decaying food. The stench was unbearable, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. At the far end of the kitchen, I spotted a door marked Exit. I sprinted toward it, throwing it open and stumbling into the night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The diner was gone. The parking lot was empty, nothing but cracked asphalt and weeds. To this day, I don't know what I experienced, but every time I drive past a rest area at night, I can't help but wonder if that diner is still out there, waiting for its next customer. It started as just another long drive through the desert, a monotonous stretch of highway with nothing but sand and scrub as far as the eye could see. I was heading to a remote campsite for a weekend of solitude, something I thought would clear my mind after a tough few months. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep, inky black, my GPS announced that I was low on gas. Perfect. The last station I'd passed was at least an hour back, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. I switched the display to Search Nearby and breathed a sigh of relief when a gas station popped up just 3 miles off the main road. The only thing stranger than its name, Last Stop Fuel, was the fact that I didn't remember seeing any signs for it along the way. The turnoff led me onto a cracked and winding road, barely wide enough for one car. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but more desert. Just as I started to think I'd made a mistake, the gas station came into view. It was a single pump under a flickering light, with a small shack off to the side. I pulled up and killed the engine, stepping out into the still night. There was no wind, no sound, just an eerie, suffocating silence. I tried the pump, but it was one of those old ones where you had to prepay inside. Of course, the door to the shack creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, and the only light came from a buzzing neon sign advertising ice-cold sodas. The place was a mess. Dusty shelves lined the walls, stocked with random items, cans of beans, packets of jerky, and bottles of water that looked ancient. Behind the counter sat an old man, hunched over a newspaper. "Pump one, please," I said, setting a $20 bill on the counter. The man didn't respond. He didn't even look up. "Sir?" I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. I reached out to tap the counter to get his attention, but as my hand moved, the man's head snapped up so fast I nearly screamed. His eyes were wrong, milky white, like he was blind, but somehow still locked onto mine. "Pump one," he repeated, his voice raspy and low. "Pay outside." Confused, I glanced at the money I'd already put down. When I looked back up, the man was gone. The chair behind the counter was empty, and the newspaper he'd been reading was now blank, its pages completely white. I bolted out of the shack, my heart racing. I wasn't about to stick around to figure out what was going on. But when I reached my car, something stopped me cold. The pump was already running, fuel spilling onto the ground, as if someone had started it for me. I yanked the nozzle out and replaced it, my hands trembling. I didn't bother getting my change. I just wanted to leave. But as I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key, my headlights illuminated something in the distance that made my stomach drop. Figures, dozens of them, standing just beyond the reach of the light. They weren't moving, just standing there like silent sentinels, their silhouettes barely distinguishable against the dark desert. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe they were cacti, or some kind of optical illusion, but deep down, I knew better. I flipped the headlights to high beam, and the figures became clearer. They were people, or at least they looked like people. Their skin was pale and cracked, their eyes black voids. They were dressed in tattered clothes, and all of them were facing me. Suddenly, one of them took a step forward, then another, and another. Panic set in. I slammed the car into gear and peeled out of the lot, the tires squealing as I sped down the narrow road. The figures didn't run, but they kept moving toward me, their jerky, unnatural movements making my stomach churn. I didn't dare look back as I reached the main highway. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and that gas station as possible. The road stretched endlessly before me, but the sense of relief was fleeting. No matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. About 10 minutes later, my dashboard lights flickered and my engine sputtered. "No," I muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. The fuel gauge still read full, but the car was slowing down. I pulled over to the shoulder, the engine dying completely. The desert was quiet again, the same oppressive silence I'd felt at the gas station. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. I sat there for a moment, trying to think, when I noticed a faint glow in my rearview mirror. It was the gas station, impossibly close. The flickering light above the pump cast long shadows across the lot, and standing in the middle of it were the figures. All of them, staring at me. They were closer now, no more than 50 feet away. And they weren't alone. Standing at the front of the group was the old man from the shack, his milky eyes shining in the darkness. He raised one hand and pointed directly at me. The headlights of my car flickered back on, along with the engine. I didn't question it. I hit the gas and sped away, my tires kicking up dust as I merged back onto the highway. The glow of the gas station finally disappeared in the distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. I made it to my campsite the next morning, though I couldn't bring myself to stay. The desert no longer felt like a place of solitude. It felt like a trap. Even now, I avoid that stretch of highway, but sometimes, late at night, I dream of the gas station, and in those dreams, I'm always running out of gas. It was supposed to be an easy drive home. I'd left my friend's house later than planned, but the forecast was clear and the roads were empty. The only thing between me and my bed was a quiet stretch of backroads winding through thick forest. I'd taken this route countless times before, but something about that night felt different. Around midnight, a dense fog rolled in, swallowing the road ahead. My high beams were useless, the light bouncing off the mist and creating a wall of white. I slowed to a crawl, my knuckles tight on the wheel. The trees on either side of the road faded into shadow, their looming shapes distorted by the fog. Then, my low fuel light blinked on. Cursing under my breath, I checked my GPS. The nearest gas station was a few miles ahead, a place I vaguely remembered stopping at years ago. Relieved, I pressed on, my eyes straining to make out the faint outline of the road. Finally, the station came into view, its lone sign glowing dimly through the fog. Service and fuel was all it said, the letters barely visible. The building itself was small and unremarkable, with a single pump out front and a flickering light over the awning. I pulled in and parked, cutting the engine. The fog seemed thicker here, clinging to the ground like a living thing. I stepped out of the car, shivering as the damp air wrapped around me. The place was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the sign swaying in the wind. I tried the pump, but it didn't work. There was a handwritten note taped to it, "Pay inside." The station door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and I was hit with the smell of mildew and stale air. The interior was dimly lit, with rows of dusty shelves stocked with random items: candy bars, motor oil, and soup. Behind the counter sat a middle-aged man with thinning hair and hollow eyes. He didn't look up as I approached. "Pump one, please," I said, handing over my card. He took it without a word, swiping it through an ancient-looking machine. As he handed it back, he finally spoke, his voice low and raspy. "You shouldn't be out here tonight." The comment caught me off guard. "Excuse me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked past me, his expression darkening. I turned to see what he was staring at, but there was nothing there, just the fog pressing against the windows. Shaking off the unease, I headed back outside and started pumping gas. The fog had grown even thicker, if that was possible, and I could barely see my car just a few feet away. As the pump clicked off, a sound cut through the silence. It was faint at first, like whispering. I froze, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices murmuring just beyond the edges of the fog. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. Heart pounding, I climbed into my car and locked the doors. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. I turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life. As I pulled out of the lot, my headlights caught movement in the fog, a fleeting shadow that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I drove slowly, my eyes glued to the faint line of the road ahead. The fog seemed alive, shifting and swirling around the car like it was trying to keep me trapped. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of movement, shadows darting across the road, shapes emerging from the mist only to vanish again. The air inside the car grew colder, and I noticed the windows starting to fog up. I turned on the defroster, but it didn't help. My breath came in shallow gasps as I realized the fog wasn't just outside. It was seeping into the car. "Stay calm," I muttered to myself, gripping the wheel tighter. That's when I saw them. Figures began to appear on either side of the road, barely visible through the haze. They stood motionless, their forms pale and indistinct, like ghosts materializing from the fog. There were dozens of them, maybe more, lining the road in eerie silence. None of them moved, but I felt their eyes on me. I pressed the accelerator, desperate to get away. The car lurched forward, the engine straining as I sped down the winding road. The figures grew closer, their faces becoming clearer. They were gaunt and hollow, their eyes black pits that seemed to follow my every move. Then, one of them stepped onto the road. I swerved to avoid it, my tires skidding on the slick pavement. The car spun out of control, and I slammed on the brakes, coming to a stop inches from a tree. My heart was racing, my hands trembling as I tried to catch my breath. When I looked up, the figures were gone. The road was empty, the fog beginning to thin. For a moment, I thought it was over, but as I tried to restart the car, a sharp knock on the driver's side window made me jump. Standing there was the man from the gas station, his hollow eyes staring at me through the glass. "You should have listened," he said, his voice muffled but clear. Before I could react, the fog surged forward, swallowing the car whole. Everything went black. When I woke up, it was morning. The fog was gone, and my car was parked safely at the side of the road. There was no sign of the gas station or the man, just the empty highway stretching out before me. I never told anyone what happened that night, but sometimes, when the fog rolls in, I hear whispers in the distance, and I wonder if the road is trying to call me back. It was nearing midnight when I finally admitted I needed a break. I'd been driving for hours on a desolate stretch of interstate, my eyelids growing heavier with each mile. The plan was to make it to a small motel another hour down the road, but the quiet hum of the car engine and the monotony of the dark highway were wearing me down. When I spotted a sign for a truck stop a couple of miles ahead, I decided to pull off. It wasn't much, a rusted billboard promising gas, food, and a place to rest. The exit ramp was steep, leading to a narrow road lined with overgrown grass. As I approached the truck stop, a sinking feeling settled in my gut. The place was abandoned. The large lot was cracked and empty, save for a single semi-truck parked near the entrance. The building itself was decrepit, its windows boarded up and its neon sign flickering weakly. The pump station canopy was caved in on one side, and weeds sprouted through the asphalt. I almost turned around, but exhaustion and curiosity got the better of me. I pulled into the lot and parked near the truck, its cab dark and lifeless. I figured I could stretch my legs and maybe find a vending machine inside the building. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it, a heavy stillness in the air, like the world was holding its breath. The only sound was the faint rustle of wind through the weeds. I glanced at the truck. The cab door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. I decided to investigate. Approaching cautiously, I peered inside the cab. It was empty, save for a few personal items, a thermos, a tattered map, and a wallet lying open on the seat. The wallet's contents were scattered, as if someone had rummaged through it in a hurry. Something about it felt wrong. A noise behind me made me freeze. It was faint, like a whisper, coming from the direction of the building. I turned, my heart pounding. The boarded-up windows stared back at me like empty eyes. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. The door to the building hung crooked on its hinges, and when I pushed it open, it creaked loudly. The interior was worse than I'd expected. Dust-covered counters, broken shelves, and graffiti scrawled across the walls. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. I walked past the counter, my footsteps crunching on shattered glass. The whispering grew louder, but it was still impossible to make out the words. It seemed to be coming from the back of the building, where a hallway led to the restrooms and storage area. My gut told me to leave, but something compelled me forward. The hallway was dark, the faint light from the front of the building barely reaching this far. The whispers became more distinct, like multiple voices overlapping in a strange, discordant melody. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I kept walking, drawn by a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. The restroom doors were on my left, their surfaces scarred with graffiti and deep gouges. The whispers seemed to be coming from the last door at the end of the hallway, a storage room. The closer I got, the colder the air became, until I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I reached the door and hesitated. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. With a deep breath, I pushed it open. The room was empty. No shelves, no boxes, nothing. Just 4 concrete walls and a floor covered in dust. But the whispers were deafening now, surrounding me, filling my head. They weren't coming from the room. They were coming from the walls. Panicked, I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, revealing something that made my blood run cold. Words were etched into the walls, thousands of them, overlapping and chaotic. They were in different languages, some I didn't recognize, but a few stood out in stark clarity: "Help US, they're here," and "Run." The whispers grew louder, turning into screams. Shadows began to move across the walls, writhing and twisting like living things. My flashlight flickered, and I felt the temperature drop even further. I backed into the corner, my heart pounding as the shadows coalesced into a single form. It was a figure, tall, skeletal, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to burn with an otherworldly light. It reached for me, its fingers impossibly long, and I felt a searing pain in my chest, as if my heart was being squeezed. "Leave," it growled, its voice a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the very ground. "This place is not for you." Somehow, I managed to scramble to my feet and throw myself at the door. It burst open, and I sprinted down the hallway, not daring to look back. The whispers followed me, chasing me out into the night. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car. The truck was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. I started the engine and sped out of the lot, the shadow of the building disappearing in my rearview mirror. To this day, I don't know what I encountered at that truck stop, but every time I pass an abandoned building, I feel a familiar chill and hear faint whispers on the wind, reminding me that some places are better left alone.